Bienvenidos a Alimentos y Emociones Podcast. Comer es inevitable. ¿Cómo comer para saciar mi apetito? Es una elección. Soy Claudia Unot. Acompáñame a hablar sobre temas de conducta alimentaria, de la relación emocional que tenemos con los alimentos y cómo satisfacer uno de los impulsos más fundamentales que tenemos en nuestra vida, nuestro apetito.
Today I have the pleasure of introducing to you Dr. Andrea Smith, who is a senior research fellow in behavioural obesity at UCL with an interest in health behaviours and the prevention of childhood obesity. She first joined the research department of behavioural science and health at UCL to complete her PhD within the obesity group in 2014 and has since worked on a variety of research projects on the links between eating behaviours and child weight. She has recently joined the MRC Epidemiology Unit at the University of Cambridge as a senior research associate in behavioural epidemiology to further develop research on the promotion of child health. Please welcome her today. We're going to talk about questionnaires as measures of appetite and all sorts of other topics. Welcome back, everybody, to Alimentos y Emociones podcast. This is another episode where I am now talking to Dr. Andrea Smith. Hello, Andrea. So wonderful to have you here.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm really well. Thank you so much for having me on. I always love chatting to you about all things appetite and just also reconnecting.
Yes, I had the opportunity to work it was desk-to-desk work when we were doing our PhDs at the BSH or HBRC as it was known then. So it's really, really wonderful, to see how you've developed all this line of work on eating behavior. And so the subject that we're going to talk about today with Andrea is how we can measure appetite through basically the use of eating behavior questionnaires. So off to you, Andrea.
Great. Well, thanks so much. And I think the best way to get this maybe started is to kind of go way back into how I actually got involved with all of this work. Because I joined the BSH to do my PhD, even though I didn't really have, much expertise in health psychology or a lot of the work that was actually going on. But it was based within the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health, or Public Care, as it was called back then. And I think what really attracted me to the work going on there was the fact that it was working on such a public health focused area of research. Everyone in that department also, there were really big issues that a lot of people are facing. So there's the obesity research group, there's also the alcohol research group, the tobacco research, cancer screening, physical activity. So all these behaviors that, a lot of us are faced with daily and some of the really big public health challenges. So it was really excited, a really exciting opportunity to get stuck in.
And why twins?
That is a great question. Thank you. So I always like to say twin studies chose me. I didn't choose the twin studies. So it was really the obesity facing nature of the work that attracted me. But little did I know that actually when I joined the obesity research group at UCL, that they had a twin cohort. So Gemini, which I believe you might have talked about this before, but Gemini is this incredible twin birth cohort that was actually established in the BSH back in 2007 and has been collecting appetitive trait and diet related data since then in this group of 2,400 families over the years, and is this treasure trove of kind of information that we can explore and investigate using research techniques. so it wasn't really the twin nature that attracted me, but obviously when I found out that this was available, I couldn't resist. I just had to, get stuck in.
Yeah, but you're a twin yourself. That's what
Yeah, sorry. I mean, yeah, I always, between you and me, I that I'm a twin. So the reason why that obviously, attracted me is because I myself am a twin. I've always grown up as a twin, and I am an identical twin. So essentially, I have a genetic clone that walks around. But I also see how very different we are, which, always poses that question, where do these differences come from? And using the twin design, it actually allows us to understand where these differences do come from.
Yes, that is really interesting. And I'm sure you'll tell us a little bit more about that in a bit. But if we dive into the questionnaires, how did this start? Where did it all start?
So I guess the kind of main area that these questionnaires focus on is the measurement of appetitive traits. So in the group, really, Jane Wardle together with Claire, they really are right now leading this area of the psychometric measurement, so questionnaire-based measurement of appetitive traits. And in the department, we host actually this database of the questionnaires. So right now we have a series of 3 that form this kind of life course approach to studying appetite. So we have the BEBQ, the Baby Eating Behavior Questionnaire, which is a multi-item questionnaire that captures and measures these appetitive traits in the first 6 months of life. And from then onwards, we have the Child Eating Behavior Questionnaire, or CEBQ. And this really can start to measure these different appetitive traits when the child starts to eat food. So from around, I guess, 2 to 3 years onwards. There's also a toddler version, which can be used. And then we have the ABQ, which you are our resident expert as you develop your PhD. And the ABQ is the Adult Eating Behavior Questionnaire, which again allows us to measure these behaviors from around 11, 12 years onwards. And this is a self-reported tool, so can be completed by an individual, whereas the BEBQ and CEBQ are actually reported by the parent on behalf of a child.
Yes, exactly. So we have these amazing measures that measure very similar traits all across the life course. It's really exciting. So what part of, say, the CB, what have you been able to work on or with these questionnaires?
So it's a hard one, sorry, but I myself, I haven't really worked on specific aspects, but I did, as part of kind of a collaborative effort within the team, work on a paper that focused on food fussiness and food neophobia within the kind of appetitive trait portfolio. But I think before we start delving into the details of these specific appetitive traits, I think it's also really important to distinguish what we mean between appetitive traits and appetite.
Yes.
Because we use this term all the time, but I think what kind of lies under that term actually can mean a lot of different things to people.
Yes, I think definitely.
Oh, sorry.
No, definitely. I think it's really important, to clarify.
Yeah, so in what we really mean with the term appetitive trait or appetite in our group is we mean the eating behaviors or the kind of innate tendencies that individuals demonstrate in relation to food and kind of the main signals that might trigger the onset or stopping of an eating occasion. And this is very different to kind of appetite in terms of more a physiological regulation, because a lot of people do appetite research or aspects of appetite in terms of, leptin and ghrelin regulation on a daily basis. But we are talking more about these kind of longer persisting traits that influence your tendencies to interact with food and want to eat food or stop eating when you're eating.
So I mean, we're all basically measuring appetite as a trait. And because we've got, this Gemini, cohort, then of course you can study all the heritability side of it as well, as opposed to just saying, right, if we go into a lab, you're just going to be eating once and that's what we're going to measure.
Yeah. And I think you bring this up really nicely, but there are so many benefits to measuring appetite using a questionnaire compared to trying to measure kind of appetite in a lab. And I think this is one of the great strengths actually of having these tools, because they really allow us to study these behaviors in big samples and allows us, to not put too much burden on the individuals, which is always, a big concern when working with real humans.
Yes.
Yeah.
You don't want to shove someone in a lab for 24 hours and ask them to be doing that for many days, do you?
No. And I mean, especially when you think about young kids, nothing sounds more horrible than having to lump them into a room, like getting public transport and, packing snacks and all that kind of stuff. So if we can just, send out questionnaires and get parents to report on their child's behaviors, we also get a really good overview of their general behavior, and not actually just how that child might be eating on that specific day. Because there are also factors that might be influencing a child's behavior or an individual's behavior on a daily basis. I mean, you might have a cold, or it might be really hot. We recently had a bit of a very hot period again.
Freak heat wave.
Yeah, well, I mean, heat wave in UK style, but it just really affects individuals' appetite. So if you, would be undertaking research on a day like that, it would really affect the kind of data that you are collecting. So again, this shows the kind of value of having these psychometric measures to collect appetite data.
So this is interesting. I'm just going to go slightly off here, but if you've got it's like, people say to me, well, you're a dietitian. What on earth were you doing? There's nothing more psychological than psychometric measurements. It's like, it's barren, I call it, because it's just so, the analysis is just very specific. And yet the data that comes out, just can be so helpful to so many areas. So in my case, nutrition, in your case, public health and, just general sciences. What have we got from all this information? Maybe you can tell us about this systematic review that's now been carried out with all the work that has been published using CBQ and BBQ data.
Yeah, absolutely. So because we were so fortunate to have, these really validated psychometric measures of appetite, they were published, and the CBQ now is one of the kind of most commonly cited measures of child appetite. And the bulk of this work actually happened over 20 or nearly 20 years ago now, and it's been used a lot in research. So recently, actually, in our group, we decided to have a look at actually how these CBQ kind of questionnaires have been used, and what their kind of consistent relationships between the child eating behavior questionnaire and the BBQ, so baby eating behavior questionnaire, and what their associations with child adiposity or child weight actually are, in the wild. Mm-hmm. What we did to answer that question is we undertook a very comprehensive review of the published peer-reviewed literature and extracted all these research studies. And we were able to find 72 separate studies that had looked at these associations. And what we then did is we undertook...
Sorry, from how many countries? Sorry.
Oh gosh, it was a lot of different countries. I can't tell you off the top of my head, but
I think it was like 12 languages. And
yeah. And the wonderful thing with the CBQ as well is that it has been translated into so many different languages, as you would know firsthand, given that you have translated it to and validated
to Spanish,
Mexican. But yeah, there are a whole host of different translations available. And so
which is really, really interesting, because you're not talking about just studies that have been carried out in 2 or 3, countries or whatever. You've got a really wide range of your population.
No, and they are, show us data from Asia, in America. There's work across Europe, South America as well. So it's a really good opportunity to try and see what these associations globally and over time actually are, out in the real world. So we undertook this systematic review with the hope that maybe some of the data would be of sufficient detail so that we could apply something that is called a meta-analysis. And that is a common tool that we use in research to pool these quantitative or kind of data estimates of these relationships into one common model. By putting these estimates of the relationship into one model, it allows us to estimate a weighted average effect size between kind of eating behaviors or appetitive traits with child weight outcomes, and gives us a really good overview to see whether the kind of food approach traits and the food avoidance traits associate with child weight in the ways that we would have expected. Now, I don't know if you have unpacked a little bit about these different traits before, but maybe...
No, I think we could go into that. I think definitely we can go into that.
Yeah, so what we didn't say earlier on, perhaps, is that there are, in each of these kind of questionnaires, we have sub-traits. So they allow us essentially to measure different aspects of appetite. And I think the main questionnaire that we focus on is usually the CBQ. And the CBQ actually consists of 35 individual items, which are rated on a 5-point scale by the parent, asking them how much they agree with the fact that their child displays a certain type of eating behavior. And within these 35 different items, we apply what we call a principal components analysis to find these kind of behaviors that cluster together. And in the child eating behavior questionnaire, we find 8 of these latent clusters, and we've been able to divide these up into 4 behaviors that kind of describe more food approach-like traits.
So more avid appetite.
Yeah, so if someone says, I have a big appetite, we would call that a food approach-like appetite profile. And these behaviors would be kind of what we call food responsiveness. We have enjoyment of food. We have, what else do we have?
Emotional overeating, and in children, desire to drink.
There we go. So these would be our 4 kind of food approach traits. And then we have the more food avoidant traits. So that would be food fussiness, slowness in eating,
satiety, responsiveness,
and emotional undereating.
Emotional undereating.
There we go. This feels like a pub quiz.
Yes, it is. Yeah, so that's the general measurements of the CBQ. Obviously, they were adapted differently to to create the BBQ. So Claire Llewellyn, who adapted the BBQ, spoke about that last week or a couple of weeks ago. And then we've got the development of the ABQ, which I got to do as my PhD. And so you have to sort of change them a bit, obviously, just to fit responses and, you know, styles for an adult as opposed to a child. And for them to be
absolutely.
like, you know, self-reported as opposed to parent report. So it's not my child, you know, refuses to eat or something. It would be like, you know, or my child eats when, you know, he is happy. It's like I eat when I am happy. Those sort of measurements. So and what did you find, you know, with the systematic review?
Yeah, so we were able to actually, from those 72 studies which we had identified, 27 of those studies allowed us to run the meta-analysis, looking at, to kind of quantify these associations between 8 different subscales with child BMI. And what we found was that actually we found, so I think it's also important to distinguish between the kind of our cross-sectional findings, so studies that looked at, you know, eating behaviors and appetitive traits at the same time with weight outcomes, so BMI Z scores. And we also found 11 studies that had looked at appetitive traits with weight, but over a longer course of time, so giving us more longitudinal insights into how weight might develop as in individuals with certain eating behaviors. But we were quite pleased to see that actually, on average, the different food approach scales did kind of positively associate with higher BMI Z scores, and the food avoidant traits positively associated with BMI Z scores. And this is, you know, goes exactly and fits in with behavioral susceptibility theory, where we kind of, I guess Claire will have elaborated already, but where
but please elaborate more.
Well, so the reason why we also, you know, look at these eating behaviors is because they are so central to regulating, you know, genetic and environmental influences in terms of shaping risk for weight gain or just adiposity in individuals more generally. And the kind of main hypothesis to behavioral susceptibility theory is that individuals who inherit these more kind of food approach type, appetitive tendencies, are at greater risk of having higher weight or a higher risk of developing overweight in the longer term. And this is exactly what we found in the data. So individuals in the studies that had been undertaken over many years, over many different countries, did have higher BMI Z scores. Those that inherited the more avoidant traits or displayed those food avoidant like behaviors had lower BMI Z scores. So in that sense, you know, as a scientist, that is a big tick, because, you know, hypothesis kind of validated, or
yes,
that's very satisfying.
Very satisfying. Then what happens when you get someone who turns around and says, oh, well, but that's just data from a psychometric measurement, you know, that's not really valid, or, you know, I don't care that your, you know, meta-analysis came out the way you wanted it or proves your theory. It's still just a questionnaire. Sorry.
I mean, that person clearly has then not looked at what validation involves, because it is incredibly rigorous, and it is, I mean, it's a science in itself. You know, you can go into it as much as you want, but I think the really important thing to say is that these questionnaires were developed going through a whole wide range of different validation procedures. So first you would look at whether the items are well understood, if they have face validity. So you give them to individuals and they look at items and you check that they make sense. They've also been undergone kind of convergent validity. So these items also map onto the other eating behavior questionnaires that exist, like the Dutch Eating Behavior Questionnaire and the 3-factor Eating Behavior Questionnaire. So the concepts or the constructs which we have found in the Child Eating Behavior Questionnaire align with other very rigorous tools as well. So even if they are slightly off, then everything that we're measuring is slightly off, and it still allows us to study human behavior. Other ways that we can validate these measures include laboratory validation tests. So this has been done with the CBQ, and also again found to be they correlate in the way that we would expect it. So that has validated that the fact that what the CBQ is measuring using the questionnaire, we see also maps onto certain behaviors in the lab in children.
Yeah. And we're going to have Susan Carnell as well come and tell us all about that sort of work.
She really led on that work when she was still at the BSH or HBRC back then.
Yeah. So that's just really interesting. How do you think that, all of this questionnaire work has impacted your own work? And if you can tell us about a bit of the, the fussy eating stuff that you did, I think that might, if you would just want to add that on, and then I can put also the link, to your papers there, because that's just really important information to have out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can't resist the opportunity to plug, my own work. So
of course, this is, this is about plugging your own work, Andrea.
Yeah, of course. Well, I think, working on these questionnaires, it's really opened my eyes, to doing research that is important to a lot of people. So very public health and public facing research. I think, at the expense of maybe not being as precise as working in a lab, perhaps, you're doing the work and measuring behaviors that affect so many different people. And what actually these data allow us to do is, look at the kind of relative importance of genetic influences to appetite compared to environmental influences. And this really gives us insights into, how we can develop interventions to help individuals, manage their appetite, or how we should be phrasing our health policies and all that kind of stuff. I think that has really shaped my thinking in relation to kind of obesity and weight-related behaviors. So I think that's kind of, taking a big step back. It really has helped me, to learn that. But then I think the way I really got stuck into learning the value of these questionnaires is when I undertook my first piece of research using the appetitive trait data. And that was back in kind of at the beginning of my PhD in around 2015, 2016, when I had the opportunity to work on a research paper looking at the relative importance of genes and the environment in shaping food fussiness, and also trying to understand the kind of underlying shared genetic pathways between food fussiness and food neophobia, which are very similar behaviors, but there are slight differences. And because they had been collected within Gemini, it allowed us to really unpick whether the genes that or genetic tendencies that underlie that one behavior, whether they are same or independent for food fussiness and food neophobia.
And what were the findings?
So it was really interesting because our first question was really to understand to what extent do genetic factors explain these behaviors really early on in life. So when children were 15 months old. And what we found actually is that the heritability, so the proportional variation of those behaviors that were explained by genes was very high. So the heritability was around 72%. So that's incredible in the field of behavioral genetics, and compared to other behaviors, this is very, very high. And it's also surprising to find such high heritability estimates so early on in life as well.
Mm-hmm.
And what we also looked at is then, whether, I guess I don't want to go too much into details, so I'll just focus actually on that finding.
Yeah.
Also what media really picked up on was really high estimates of heritability in food fussiness, because it indicates that food fussiness is a genetically influenced behavior, which kind of goes against the narrative where parents are often blamed for their child's food fussy tendencies. If you see a child in a cafe that is throwing their meal on the floor, you see people saying like, oh, a bad mom or whatever. But actually what the data tell us is that it is a really genetically influenced behavior, and that perhaps blaming parents is wrong.
It relieves you as a mother, that thinking that you're not doing it all wrong, and that your child doesn't want to eat and it's all your fault, basically, because you're being a bad mother. It's quite a relief. When I found out your results, I thought, oh, what a relief.
Yeah. And I think, as soon as you find out that the behavior is genetically influenced, it can also be really helpful, because it allows us to kind of, parents who are, frustrated when they create a meal and they put it down and they want to sit down and have a meal with their toddler, and the toddler will just sit there and see it, runs away from the table, throws a tantrum, whatever it is. Like, it can be really frustrating, and also can feel, you're being a bad parent, or you start questioning yourself. And I think when parents, understand that it is just this kind of innate tendency for young children to be sometimes very fussy towards food, it can help them, and it takes that tension out of meal times, which itself doesn't help as well. So by removing the tension, it also actually helps parents to work with their child to overcome this aversion.
Yes, definitely. Well, that's really, really interesting. Where else has it taken you? Tell us a bit about the work that you did, with all the OPRU and your postdoc and stuff, and where you're, what direction you're heading in now, because I think that, a lot of people would be really interested to know as well what you're doing.
Yeah, of course. So I've been around now in the group for UCL for quite a while, and I love, this work to me is fascinating, because every human eats, everyone has, you need to eat. But the reason why we eat and how we eat is not, driven by homeostasis, that you're not a sim that, with a green bubble over your head that you need to eat, right? So it's just, to me, it's fascinating to understand these different reasons, because they are psychological, they are, also a bit biological, but they're also, environmentally patterned by our society and all these other things. So some really complex behaviors, and I think that is what has, kept me in obesity-related research, but also in general public health research. So I was then lucky after I finished up my PhD within the kind of Gemini related team. I started a postdoc in the NIHR Obesity Policy Research Unit. And this is a unit that was set up to kind of help the Department of Health and Social Care to come up with the kind of most relevant and evidence-based policies to improve childhood obesity policies in England. So we were working on a range of different projects that would hopefully produce data to shape the way policies are framed and introduced in the UK. And I was focusing primarily again on childhood and on kind of the early years and how we can improve policies in that area. So I ended up doing leading on these two very different but very fun projects. So the first one was focused on the development of a 3D body size scale toddlerhood. So what BMI and body shape looks like in toddlers, but using 3D models and developing these visual tools to understand how different weight statuses look across the entire weight spectrum in the early years. This is, now in retrospect, like it sounds a bit like, body shaming, but it's not about that. It's about trying to understand what perhaps, a child that is at greater risk of becoming or developing obesity later in life might look like already in the, when the child is 2 or 3 years old, because adiposity or, fatty tissue deposits very differently in children than in adults. Because if you think of a toddler, they have their, little round tummies and their chubby little thighs, but that doesn't mean that they are, necessarily overweight or have overweight.
Yeah.
So we were trying to really understand how that looks like in those early years, with the hopes of using such a visual tool to initiate conversations with parents during pre-existing healthcare appointments about child weight, and then using those opportunities to have positive conversations about what can be done to manage and work with their child to optimize their kind of weight and growth trajectories going forward.
Yeah, that's very interesting. What was the second?
The second project was the development of an evidence-based infographic of dietary recommendations for women,
pregnant women. Yep.
And kind of telling them the foods that they should be eating during pregnancy, rather than focusing on the really elaborate and extensive lists of food that women should be avoiding during pregnancy. And again, we kind of chose a more positive angle to really capitalize on these many kind of contact points that pregnant women have during their pregnancy with the healthcare system, to convey positive information about maybe, focus on lean proteins and focus on fruit and veg, rather than saying like, oh, congratulations, and now cut out alcohol, coffee, soft cheeses, fun stuff. So it was more about re-angling it, and also kind of incorporating more cutting edge and more evolving evidence about kind of lower glycemic index foods, which hadn't really been properly reflected in the latest guidelines. And I think the main kind of angle or novelty of that research project was that we were focusing on conveying that information using images and logos, and condensing it all down into just, a one-pager that could be handed out in like, a 5-minute conversation. Because again,
in with the GPs or something,
yeah, and because GPs themselves, they don't get a lot of training in nutrition, so if it's all condensed, they can just hand it over, the information is there. They don't have to have a massive conversation about it because they don't have the time.
Yeah.
And the health visitors, they
and
just
just
don't have the time.
for those who don't know, a GP is a general practitioner, because we might have a bit of problems here in Mexico trying to understand what a GP is. Anyway, or in other parts of, Latin America, where someone might listen to this podcast as well. And where is your research taking you now? And that way, maybe we can sort of close off, unless there's something else that you want to talk about, that I think relating to the work that you're doing now is really important as well.
So, yeah, I mean, that I learned a lot of new techniques of how we can really produce the research that is relevant to shaping public health policy. And I think that has also kind of, again, reconfirmed my passion, for public health. And at the end of the day, public health can only be done when we have policy support, because policy directs us. They indicate where the funding goes. They really, allow us or don't allow us to, optimize health for everyone. So right now I have started a new post at the MRC Epidemiology Unit at the University of Cambridge, where I've joined a research group that focuses again on kind of young people. So it's the Behavioural Epidemiology group. And in that group, they really focus on understanding the determinants of health behaviour in young people, and also how we can intervene to optimize the health of young people. And what kind of stands out to me here is that the group has like this unique expertise in physical activity and diet, and allows to combine them both. So this is where I see currently like some of my new research going, is looking at this interface of how our diet related behaviors, appetite and physical activity related. How are they independently associated with health outcomes? How do they interact to really help us understand this really, complex interplay of factors that we all, are faced with on a daily basis. And I think right now I'm looking more as well into mental health and mental well-being, especially in the wake of the pandemic as well. Mm-hmm. We know that we really need to strengthen our public health systems to support young people as the pandemic, fingers crossed, might be easing. Who knows what's happening? But what we do know is that at the forefront right now, our priority needs to be in supporting the mental well-being of children, because a happy child and a confident child or young person is also one that is more likely to be engaging in healthy behaviors, and in the longer term that will optimize their health. So I think that definitely the way I see myself going right now, at least in the shorter term. And yeah, longer term, there's still lots of ideas to try out. But that's myself at the moment.
I think that's amazing. Do you see, being able to sort of fit in your questionnaire or the questionnaire work as well with all of this, to be able to sort of uncover as well appetite in that, with the eating behavior? Yeah.
There are so many questions about how appetite interacts with different health behaviors, which still remains to be explored. Even within Gemini, but also other cohorts and other studies. So this is only the beginning, and all the knowledge that a researcher or myself that I've learned from working with questionnaires will always shape any research going forward. So this is just the beginning.
Well, I think we've covered quite a lot, because we started with questionnaires and we've been down a sort of fussy eating pathway, and plus, all your policy research work and now your new work as well. I mean, I think this is really interesting. Andrea, where could people find you? I think on Twitter is probably a good place, and I'll also leave it, below so that people can go and, see the work that you've done, all the work that you continue doing. I think it's really important. Give us a Twitter account, please.
Of course. So I have a very generic surname. So yeah, I can be found on Twitter, but be careful that you follow the right one. So you can find me on Twitter at Andrea D, so the letter D _Smith, and that's my handle. And you can always look me up on Google Scholar as well if you want to read any of the publications. I think those are my main kind of profiles where you can find me. But otherwise, I'm sure just a Google search might throw up something.
Thank you so much for your time. I know you are a very, very busy lady doing all sorts of amazing things, and it's really, really wonderful to be able to speak to you. Thank you for, sharing all this information with us, and it's a pleasure to have you here, and I hope you can come back one day soon and talk to us about all sorts of other areas like food preferences that we still need to discuss.
Absolutely, it was my pleasure, and yeah, to perhaps recording another episode soon.
Okay, and everybody, if you know of anybody who would be interested in this line of work, who is interested in knowing about the questionnaires, etc., don't forget to share, and don't forget to to send it off and to push the notification button so that you know when the next episode is going to appear. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm going to say it in Spanish. Nos seguimos nutriendo. We continue to nourish each other. Thank you very much for listening. Bye.
Nos vemos en un próximo episodio de Alimentos y Emociones Podcast. Y recuerda, nos seguimos nutriendo.